Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. This hour, we're going to spend some time, first of all, talking about getting our schools reopened, and an issue that shouldn't even be that controversial, except the fact that the president and the Secretary of Education and others are saying that that should happen. And even though there are lots of experts with the American Academy of Pediatrics saying the very same thing, I guess even that has become political. So we're going to spend some time talking about that. And then we'll get into the fact that every significant hour, there are, again, 2,600 new cases of coronavirus. And so we're going to talk about some of that, the vaccines, and a number of other issues. Next hour, we'll get into the issue of health care and whether hospitals are eventually going to become obsolete. We'll be talking with Anthony Hopp about that, Vice President at Samaritan Ministries. And then Brian Kluth will be with us as we talk about how to bless your pastor. And in between, we'll get into some other issues, of course, Portland front and center, as well as some of the controversy there involving federal troops. So there is a lot to cover, but I thought first off, we would go to our good friend Jenny Beth Martin, who is the honorary chair of the Tea Party Patriots, an individual that actually under her leadership under the Tea Party Patriots Citizen Fund has grown to be one of the largest, most effective national umbrella groups, and of course has been with the Tea Party Patriots Citizen Fund for many years, is a graduate of the University of Georgia. Her book that came out a couple of years ago, Tea Party Patriots, The Second American Revolution. And Jenny Beth, welcome back to Point of View.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
Let's, if we can, talk about a meeting that you attended, and it was the National Dialogue Safety Reopening America's Schools Roundtable. And tell us what you learned there, because it does seem to me that it shouldn't be that controversial about opening the schools, but apparently everything involving this president has become controversial. What did you find out?
That is true. Everything involving the president it is controversial, and frankly, everything in our country at this point is political, it seems. It was a meeting at the White House, a roundtable with President Trump, and I was able to speak on my perspective as a mother and a business owner and a single mom, and about the importance of opening schools, and somebody also who's been in touch with thousands of people around the country who want schools reopened. What I really found interesting and what I learned, I really enjoyed the most hearing from the Academy, the American Academy of Pediatrics, who talk about the risk of not opening schools and how much more important and less risky it is to children to open schools rather than to leave them closed. This isn't just parents wanting to be back in school. It's not just children wanting to be back in school. It is the fact that if we continue to leave schools closed, it's much riskier from a health perspective to children than it would be to open them.
Well, and again, you've got the educational issue, the lost learning, because we always talk about the summer slump when the kids go home come June, but they've been out of school since March, the widening gaps in educational achievement. Then you talked about the health issues, their mental health, as well as they might be at home where there are risks to them that you might have detected. when they were in school. You also have just the difficulty of sometimes in especially some of these low income areas of getting enough to eat because they were dependent in the past on being able to get breakfast and lunch. Now that is closed down and has made it very difficult. So it seems like at every level, the argument is there are tremendous risks in keeping them home. The few possible risks of putting them in school are very minor compared to the major risks that we've actually identified over the last couple of months. Wouldn't you agree?
I do agree. It is very, very risky to keep them home. Everything that you're talking about, the slump, all of that is important. And one thing that I talked about at the roundtable, and it really concerns me, is that if you are a lower income person, or if you live in rural America, as I have learned that this is the case, I learned this from the American Farm Bureau, that a lot of our farming communities have some of these same problems. You either do not have a computer for every single person in the house because you can't afford that, or you don't have the Wi-Fi capability for everyone in the house to be online streaming video at the exact same time. And in fact, in the rural communities, they may not even have really good Wi-Fi capabilities and internet access. And some of them were having to go to local McDonald's to get online with Wi-Fi to do their school. And that is just, forget the summer slump. There's no learning going on when your students, your children are not even able to connect online. It works great for those families who are able to afford it, but what if you can't?
Yes, well, that's a very good question. I do have a link to teapartypatriots.org, and I thought I might just mention that Tea Party Patriots Action actually had a letter that was urging with the CDC to actually revise the guidelines for reopening the schools. And if I understand that right, the letter was signed by like about 150 doctors, 70 national groups, 240 nurses and healthcare professionals, 330 teachers, almost 5,000 Americans. It does seem to me that there's pretty much a groundswell here if people are willing to pay attention to the science.
That is correct. There is a groundswell of people who want schools to be reopened if they're paying attention to the science. What I've also come to learn and what I realize is that there are a lot of Americans, the majority of Americans are still very, very afraid of the virus. And I am not in any way diminishing the seriousness of the virus. I understand it's serious. There's a difference in the seriousness versus the paralyzing fear that people have. And some of those people who are so afraid don't want schools to open and are actively trying to prevent it. I'm in favor of opening schools and let the school district give some sort of alternative for people who don't want to go back to school, or maybe they have a high-risk family member, so they really think that it is not good for their family because of health reasons. Give those people the ability to do some sort of virtual school. But the ones where it's not at high risk, we need them to be able to have the option to go back to school.
Let's take a break, and when we come back, let me just mention that at your website, teapartypatriots.org, you have an article came out yesterday, Harvard professors call for schools to open, and you and I were thinking the same thing because I found this one at the Boston Globe because I get some of the information there, and it was actually the same professors at Harvard. It is kind of funny because they say ignore Trump because they can't bring themselves to say that, well, maybe on this case Trump is right. Ignore Trump, but then listen to the science and actually open up the schools. So we'll get into that a little bit later, but both you on your website, which is teapartypatriots.org, and on ours, pointofview.net, have some information about that. But when we come back, we might talk about, okay, if we open up the schools, what's happening in other countries like Europe or Australia? Are those schools opening, and what has been their experience there? So we'll get into more details. And if you have some thoughts about opening the schools, or whether you feel that they should still be closed down and do virtual learning, we'd love to hear from you. 1-800-351-1212. Jenny Beth Martin with us with Tea Party Patriots. We'll be back right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
The headlines for a New York Times article said it all. Churches were eager to reopen. Now they're a major source of coronavirus cases. It's a scary headline that isn't even close to being accurate. Tim Chalice, in a blog, started with the numbers in the story. It talks about 650 coronavirus cases from nearly 40 churches. That's not many, especially when you realize that nearly half of the cases come from one church in Oregon that was acting irresponsibly. Put these numbers in context. There are 3 million coronavirus cases in America. The 650 listed in the article represents roughly 0.02% of the total. And the 40 churches mentioned seem very small when you assume that there are more than 300,000 churches in America. Ed Stetzer went even further to list 5 issues with the New York Times article. First, churches have cooperated and have been remarkable partners. Second, hyperbole helps no one. Using words like major and erupted to describe 650 cases is obviously misleading. Third, the article understated the obvious. A large number of infections are linked to one single church that ignored all the CDC guidelines. Fourth, this kind of article causes people to dismiss important information. Finally, the article misses the point. If you read the article carefully, you will come to the opposite conclusion of the headline. Sure, there were a few churches that made bad decisions, but most churches seem to be acting responsibly in the midst of this pandemic. Most readers probably just read the headline or maybe the opening paragraph. Others merely saw the link to the article in the Drudge Report with the ominous headline, "Churches Now Major Source of Spread." This is a classic example of fake news. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Socialism, go to viewpoints.info/socialism. That's viewpoints.info/socialism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes, and Jenny Beth Martin with us. If you would like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Maybe you have some comments about reopening the schools, and love to hear either way. 1-800-351-1212. And Jenny Beth Martin, first of all, let's talk about Europe. You know, we used to hear former President Barack Obama, even some of our Democratic friends say, you know, we need to be more like Europe. And I don't necessarily agree with that, but in this particular case, that might be something that would be worthwhile, because don't we have some pretty good examples from Europe about schools being open and actually not facing the kind of threats and concerns that many people are afraid of?
Yes, that is exactly right. In fact, America is not trailblazing here. We're actually lagging behind other countries around the world. And in Europe, there have been 22 European countries that have open schools. And what they learned from that is that there has been no significant increase in spread of coronavirus among the students, the teachers, the staff, or their parents. So we know the thing that people are the most concerned about is that it's going to increase the spread of coronavirus or COVID-19 by allowing schools to reopen and have students in the classroom physically. But when you look at what's happened with 22 European countries, it just simply is not the case.
What we seem to be finding, and I want to get your thoughts on this as well, is that the original thought is that these kids, young kids, might be super spreaders. You know, they will get the virus and spread it to everybody else. And that is sometimes true of the other kinds of flus that we've had. But this seems to be just the opposite. The younger you are, the less likely you are to get an infection. And even if you get an infection, it seems less likely that you pass it on. So instead of them being spreaders, they seem to almost be like a break. And so in that respect, I think at least we could say for the children, there's probably a pretty low risk, don't you think?
Exactly. There is a very low risk. Children just simply are not super spreaders of this virus. Now, the decisions that were made in March and April were made because we just didn't know enough about this brand new virus. We're 6 months into it now, or close to 6 months definitely since it was in China, and we know a lot more about the virus now. And what we know is that children can get it, so I'm not saying they cannot get sick. They just don't die from it very much at all. In fact, statistically speaking, 0.0% of 14-year-olds and younger die from it. You have to go out several zeros to get to that, to the death rate for it. But not only that, when they do get it and they get sick, they recover very quickly, and they are not known to spread it from adults. We don't have cases where it is spreading from children to adults. Adults to children, yes. Children back to adults, it's just not happening. They're not super spreaders of the virus.
Let's also talk about that for just a minute, because a lot of people have said, okay, well, I'm not as concerned about children, although ask any parent or grandparent, and they're a little bit concerned. But the argument that is coming now from the teachers' unions and the educational establishment is there might be a risk to the teachers and the staff. Now, if you recognize that the average age of the teachers in the public schools is 40 and below, then you first of all recognize they aren't at a high risk. But let's say you have somebody that's a master teacher, 55 years of age, 64 years of age, hasn't maybe retired yet. There seems to be still some things we could do. Those individuals might have to teach with virtual learning, but I think there's enough ingenuity and American entrepreneurism to begin to figure out how to solve some of those problems, don't you think?
Yes, I do think that there is. The fact is, we figured out how to do this, how to live and to socially distance ourselves so that we reduce the spread as much as we possibly can in grocery stores. We figured it out at Walmart. We figured it out at Target. Restaurants have figured it out. So if we can figure it out in all of those places, I am confident that schools and the teachers who we trust to teach our children are smart enough to be able to figure it out among themselves. So I think that we can find ways to slow the spread and to make sure that among adults inside the school building, they still are socially distancing.
What would you say to our listeners? Because you know as well as anyone, Jenny Beth, that we actually have really active-oriented kind of listeners. And when I go to teapartypatriots.org, I see that you have a number of action items, as we do on pointofview.net. So what would you recommend? Because you have information here about Harvard professors call for schools to open, churches are under assault, which, by the way, is one of my commentaries today, a variety of other issues related to the relief bill and communism and socialism and things like that, and even China, which has been a topic almost every day here on Point of View. So how can people get involved with you, and what are some of the action items you're encouraging them to be involved with?
Well, thank you so much for that. We always encourage people to go to teapartypatriots.org/this week. And every week we update our call to action. So for this week, the number one call to action is to download a sample letter that you can write to your local school board urging them to reopen schools. And we have the whole thing written out. You just need to modify it so that you're sending it and customizing it for your own local school board and putting your name at the bottom. It's a Microsoft Word. It's very easy to edit it. And then we have some articles that we think are worth sharing online in social media. And we also have a YouTube video that we're encouraging people to share online. Beyond that, we have calls. We're asking people to make calls into the White House about the spending bill that is moving forward to make sure that they're educating themselves and their families about civics and education, because we're seeing that there's this cancel culture is trying to downplay and diminish the importance of our founding documents. And then we have another link over to something that the Heritage Foundation is doing tomorrow we thought our people would be interested in. So
Yes.
if you can only do one thing, download the letter and send it to your school board.
Might just mention that the Heritage Foundation element is tomorrow. It's Friday, and it's on wokeism at work, how critical theory and anti-racism training divide America. So we'll give it some of that information. But again, you've got a whole section here on reopening the schools, and you can download the sample letter, make some changes there. You can call the White House. You can even make real civics education a priority. And so there's just a number of things that you can find. And of course, we do have a link to the Tea Party Patriots .org, and then you just ask through that latest update, and you'll have everything you need. So, Jenny Beth, I appreciate you, first of all, attending that particular event there at the White House, the National Dialogue Safety Reopening America's Schools Roundtable. Also, of course, that letter that you put together, and just some of the information about the fact that if we want to be like all these other European countries, and I sometimes think there's some danger in that, then we should follow what they've been doing, because we're not exactly out there in the front. We're lagging behind, and all the other particular major republics and democracies are already providing school for their kids, and we are certainly fearful of that right now here in the United States. So thank you for being on Point of View, and thank you for being up front on this very important issue today.
Thank you so much, Kerby.
We're going to take a break, and when we come back, let me get to another aspect of this, because as I alluded just a minute ago, one of the articles we've posted, I had to do that if for no other reason than it just made me smile, because you have a number of these individuals from Harvard University. They obviously don't like Donald Trump, no surprise there, and they are in the Harvard School of Public Health. So on the one hand, they can't bring themselves to say that the president is right, so they go through with the first paragraph saying dismissive things about the president and finally saying, okay, ignore Trump. Then the next paragraph says, but listen to the science, which says the schools can and should reopen. And then at the very end, they end with the same sort of thing. Ignore Trump, listen to the evidence, reopen the schools. So it's just so different, because, if a conservative were to write this, and there are times when I will even do that, and we'll say, you don't hear too often where I agree with, some liberal progressive, but in this case, I think we all agree. But they just could not bring themselves to say, well, in this case, Donald Trump is right, and we agree with him. Nope, they just simply said, ignore Trump, but then we want you to open the schools, which is exactly what Donald Trump, the president, has said. That's just what, of course, the Secretary of Education has said, Betsy DeVos. But we just can't possibly acknowledge that what the president or the Secretary of Education said. So they give us some really good reasons, and I've mentioned them just briefly with Jenny Beth, but I want to come back in a little more detail, because I know there's some of you out there that are saying, are you really sure? I'm concerned about my children and grandchildren, and there are risks both ways, but the risk of not putting them back in the classroom is huge, and you'll begin to learn from these Harvard professors right after these important messages.
2020. It's been a pretty eventful year. We've experienced international tensions over the coronavirus and lockdowns, economic uncertainties, cities overrun by protests, rioting, and looters, and coming soon, a presidential election. Question: where will you get real news, credible opinion, clear biblical thinking on the things that matter most? Answer: Point of View Radio with Kerby Anderson and the team. You can make sure their voices continue speaking loud and clear by taking a moment right now and joining the Truth Team. It is easy, but you do have to visit our website or make a quick call. Go to pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. You have the power to make a difference. Joining the Truth Team can help ensure that millions of people will get a different opinion from the major purveyors of fake news. We don't get big advertising dollars like the networks or tax money like PBS. We depend on you. pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, let me, if I can, for just a few minutes, talk about this particular article we've posted. It comes from the Boston Globe, written by a number of Harvard professors who are actually professors at the Harvard School of Public Health. Now, you can see they don't like the president, and that's understandable. How many people in Boston probably do? But again, they say that he's politicized this by saying that this is fear-mongering Democrats opposed to in-person schooling against Republicans committed to reopening the economy. Actually, I think that's fairly accurate. But nevertheless, they said as public health professionals and parents of school-age children, we urge the country, ignore Trump. But then the next line they say, essentially, Trump is right, but they don't. They say, listen to the science, which says that schools can and should reopen for in-person learning with appropriate risk reduction strategies, while officials also implement aggressive steps to keep community transmission low. And then this is, I think, a very helpful summary, because every one of the points I'm going to make has a link, an HTML link, and so you can go then to find the other articles related to that. So they say, first of all, listen to the American Academy of Pediatrics, and of course I've quoted from them many times on the program, which argue for focusing on the science and not politics in support of a return of in-person schooling with new investments in safety, describing in-person school as fundamental to the well-being of the nation's children. Then there's this pretty significant list of what happens when we don't have kids in school. Prolonged time away from the schools has led to months of lost learning. We've already talked about that. We've talked about this summer slump that almost always takes place from June to August. Well, essentially for a lot of these students, they have been out since March. So you can imagine that. The widening gaps in educational achievement, and there's all sorts of documentation for that as well, because the wealthy families can always hire a tutor. Maybe they're at home and making sure the kids are doing their work. They have access to good internet, all sorts of things, which then put them at an advantage and put many in the lower income households at a stark disadvantage. So there's learning and widening gaps. Then adding months more to this toll will be the educational disaster that some children may never recover from. There are some windows of time in the learning of a young person. If they don't master some of that at that time, they never really succeed. And the other day, to their credit, Channel 8 News interviewed the interim headmaster at Prestonwood Christian Academy, who is making that very significant case. Because after all, if they don't learn some of these things like grammar, spelling, whatever it might be, it just kind of carries through life. So there is a window of time that comes and then fades away, and that's really dangerous. Then, of course, school closures also threaten some children's safety, because you have some that may have been abused, but you don't pick up on it because the school nurse or the teachers don't pick up on it, due to increased child neglect. It also hurts the children's mental health. They're not socializing with other children. They're not interacting. Their brains are maybe not necessarily being stimulated by the things that are at home. And then back to just another physical one, many of them aren't getting enough to eat. I mean, if you are well aware of the fact that these school lunch programs and even the breakfast programs are essential to having children that are going to actually be able to focus on the educational issues in front of them and work on their lessons, they're going to be able to do that if they've been able to eat correctly, and that oftentimes is another function of the schools. So those are obviously the harms that come from shutting down the schools. Let's look at the other part of this, because, again, this article does a very good job of this. The harms of school closure are clear, but what are the risks of reopening? We talked about that a little bit with Jenny Beth, but I thought we'd get into it a little bit more. There are multiple studies, and the footnotes go to that, showing that children are not only less likely to become seriously ill from COVID-19, they're almost half as likely to get infected in the first place. Overall, the rate of infection requiring hospitalization among school-age children, that would be ages 5 to 17, since the pandemic through July 4th was roughly 1 in 20,000. Okay, so yes, we'll probably, if we were to open up the schools, have some story that will be carried by one of the local affiliates about this child had to be put in the hospital. Yes, that was the 1 out of 20,000. But the other 19,999 did not have to go into the hospital. Okay, what about the risk to the teachers and staff? Again, they say listen to the science. A report led by the head of the Centers for Disease Control under President Barack Obama. Now, they had to make that clear because they didn't want somebody to think, well, that's just something that the Trump administration did. Concluded that children appear less likely than adults to transmit COVID-19 to others, unlike other viruses like influenza. Though this evidence is still limited and preliminary, studies examining schools, there's another footnote, with known COVID-19 cases have shown low transmission rates. For instance, in one case, just 2 students and no teachers infected out of the 863 close contacts. So you can see the children tend to be a break rather than a spreader. And others show 0 confirmed infections among teachers and students who sat in the same classroom with a symptomatic child. Other studies shed light on why childhood infection rates and school-based transmission may be so low. Can I get technical for just a minute? It turns out that children have lower levels of these receptors in their airways. Those receptors are the ones that allow the coronavirus, as a kind of a hook on it. It allows those to hook on, and it turns out that children don't have as many of those receptors. Men tend to have the most, which is why men tend to disproportionately get COVID-19 compared to women. And children have less, which means, again, why even if they are taking in the virus, it is less likely to connect up to those airways. And so that's significant. One other one, and I'm not going to get too gross here, children also don't generate as many breath droplets, which are actually what can actually transmit COVID-19 in the first place. So again, near the end, they say, now we're not advocating a return to schools as usual. They're pointing out that, sure, schools must aggressively implement proven risk reduction strategies. This could be testing, contact tracing, physical distancing, mask wearing, of course, hand washing, hand hygiene, well-ventilated spaces, all sorts of things. Maybe staggering the arrival and dismissal times, all sorts of things that can and should be done. But near the end, they simply say reopening the schools should not be an us versus them argument. It's not a Democratic versus Republican argument. It's about our children and about the evidence. We should be following the science that says in-person schooling for our kids is too valuable to give up, and that the risk of school-based transmission appear to be low. We should be investing in adequate testing and tracing resources, making our physical school environment safer, and encouraging a practical balance of social distancing in the classrooms with learning and the reality of children's lives. So the end, got to get it one more time. Ignore Trump, listen to the evidence, reopen the schools. So they just go out of their way to not ever acknowledge that anybody in the Trump administration, whether it's President Donald Trump, whether it's Vice President Mike Pence, whether it's anybody on the coronavirus task force, whether it might be the Secretary of Education, Betty DeVos, anybody, we just cannot bring ourselves to acknowledge any of those people might actually be right in this case. And they also, of course, in case you're wondering, say that while you reopen the schools, you've got to do all you can to keep the community rates of COVID-19 low, because when we come back from the break, I'm going to point out that every hour we get 2,600 new coronavirus cases in America. This is literally out of control right now. But at the same time, that's why they say we should open the schools, make sure we close down the bars, gyms, and a variety of other places that might actually be spreading the virus. So they're, I think, very careful in trying to thread the needle by, on the one hand, recognizing that there are certainly no situations in our world where there are no risks. But the risk that of our affected students right now in terms of lost learning, in terms of safety, in terms of mental health, in terms of just getting enough to eat, far outweigh the possibility that one or two children in a particular school might have to be hospitalized. And so when you weigh the risks in that regard, I think you can see why more and more individuals, not just these individuals at the Harvard School of Public Health, but the American Academy of Pediatrics and a variety of others, are saying it is time to open the schools. Now that I say that, when we come back from the break, I'm going to talk about some really concerning numbers about what is happening right now with the coronavirus, and give you a little bit of an update on the vaccine and the progress that now is coming in another area where the government is spending money. So we'll talk about that right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Now, for a few more minutes, let me give you the other side of the story here, because even though I think it is probably safe to reopen the schools, we are in the midst of a real pandemic. And just think about this. Every hour, 2,600 new cases are reported. And the argument is always, well, that's because we're doing more testing. No, I think I'll show you in just a minute that there is certainly some of that due to the testing. As a matter of fact, a good graphic for those of you that are watching online right now. Let me hold up this little chart because you can actually see that, and you can find this as well. Yes, daily testing has gone up, but what you see is the daily cases at one point were down, and now they've risen. It's kind of like a V shape. Same thing here when we're looking at the current hospitalizations, which is the biggest concern. We, back in early April, had about 60,000 people in the hospitals. It dropped down to about 30,000. Now it's risen again to 60,000. We may, as we'll talk about in just a minute, have more people in the hospital now than we've ever had before. And up until now, we always had people saying things like, well, you know, this was just to flatten the curve. Well, we flattened the curve, and then it is exploded once again, which is amazing. So again, just think about this. We're on the air here almost an hour, 2,600 new cases every hour. Matter of fact, if you read my commentary today, I'm using this example to point out how the New York Times really was engaged in fake news by saying churches are the major source of coronavirus cases. And they documented all of about 650. But I use the example that we have about 3 million coronavirus cases. This article here says we're getting close to 4 million. So even just in the last week, my estimates are based upon some old numbers, because now we may have 4 million cases pretty soon. And of the 20 countries that have had the largest outbreaks, the United States now ranks second in cases per capita, exceeded only by Chile. And with 143,000 deaths so far, that's a 4.4 fatalities per 10,000 people. Then again, we rank about sixth in terms of deaths per capita, behind, of course, some of the countries you might imagine: Spain, Italy, Chile, France, and the United Kingdom. And so, again, what is happening is this article here: our hospitals look like war zones. An eye-opening study from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention said that coronavirus cases are a lot higher than the numbers reported in some parts of the country, up to 13 times higher, because so many who were infected didn't know it and unwittingly spread the virus. Now we're seeing the results of that undetected spread. Confirmed cases in the United States are, as we said before, edging towards 4 million. And of course, we gave you the number of those who have died. A new study has also found, interestingly enough, no surprise here, that social distancing with mask and hand washing could stop 90% of these large outbreaks. And so now we're having people talking about the vaccines. So let me give you an update here, because in the past we've talked about Moderna, which is out of Boston, AstraZeneca, which is one that is actually out of England, tied into the University of Oxford. But let me bring another one, Pfizer. On Wednesday, the Trump administration announced a very significant $1.95 billion advance order for 100 million doses of a vaccine being developed by Pfizer and also by the German-based BioNTech, which will hopefully be available at the end of the year. Of course, that's a great dream, but we'll see whether it plays itself out. Drug makers are right now in their final phase of the clinical trials, and so we'll see where that goes. This is all part of what the administration has called Operation Warp Speed, which has been accelerating vaccine development like never before. As you have seen us say, and as I've written about before, a little bit concerned about how fast some of that is going, but nevertheless hoping to deliver up to 300 million doses by January 2021. Pfizer and the German company reported preliminary results from 45 volunteers showing that the mRNA vaccine actually generated levels of neutralizing antibodies, which are anywhere from 1.8 to 2.8 times higher, but also, this is key, also stimulated T cell response. Again, I don't want to get too biological here, but the trouble with antibodies is they can diminish over time. But if you stimulate T cell response, that will give you maybe a longer lasting protection. But this article also reminds us, of course, we have AstraZeneca, we have Moderna, and of course, last week Moderna and the NIH published the phase 1 trial findings showing that it also uses an mRNA vaccine, stimulated neutralizing antibodies in a number of volunteers, though you needed a second injection 28 days after the first one. And so Moderna is now going to begin its phase 3 trial while it continues its phase 2 trial, which again, these always used to be sequential. Now they're tending to be simultaneous. And then, of course, you have the one out of England, AstraZeneca, which is more of the typical kind of vaccine where they're genetically engineering a particular virus that actually causes the common cold and using that to actually stimulate a strong antibody response in that particular regard. So that will give you a little bit of an idea of what is taking place there. While we talk about hospitalizations, we may mention this in the National Hour since we'll have our listeners from California there, but more than 400,000 people in California have been infected with the coronavirus. 7,700 have died, and more Californians are currently in the hospital than at any other time during the pandemic. Nearly 7,100 people are in a hospital bed with COVID-19. About 28% of those hospitalized patients are receiving intensive care, according to the state public health data released on Tuesday morning. And it, again, just illustrates the issue of the vaccine, because if we have the vaccine and we also have a lot of people that have developed the antibodies because they did actually have COVID-19, we might get to that holy grail called herd immunity. And the most recent studies, which I just mentioned a minute ago, are now when they've looked at the blood samples of all sorts of individuals that came in for routine testing for the virus, they have concluded that now maybe 10 times more people were infected than previously reported. So that means the level of people with antibodies is much higher than we thought. As a matter of fact, much, much higher than we thought. And if you can add the vaccine to it, you get to a threshold where maybe you actually can protect people from getting the COVID-19 disease. To give you one example from the CDC data, they concluded that in New York, the state of New York, there were probably 642,000 people that were infected by the virus by April 1st, when actually the official count said there were only 53,000. So there's a real difference between 642,000 and 53,000. And it, again, I think illustrates only so well that maybe we will eventually have a sense of safety in the midst of what right now are record number of COVID and coronavirus cases every single hour, approaching very soon 4 million. So just a couple of issues to pay attention to. When we come back from the break, we'll get into some other topics because, after all, we have all sorts of controversy right now about whether or not the federal government is going to send in people in the federal government in law enforcement to clean up some of the cities where anarchy and rioting reigns. So we'll talk about that. We'll even mention some of the commentaries that have come out in the last few days, even by Senator Ted Cruz and others. And, of course, give you a chance to join the conversation. Anthony Hopp will be with us. We'll talk about how hospitals might eventually be obsolete in many areas of the country, since more and more of healthcare is becoming decentralized. So we've got a lot to cover, and we will do that right after these important messages.
(2020). It's been a pretty eventful year. We've experienced international tensions over the coronavirus and lockdowns, economic uncertainties, cities overrun by protests, rioting, and looters, and coming soon, a presidential election. Question: where will you get real news, credible opinion, clear biblical thinking on the things that matter most? Answer: Point of View Radio with Kerby Anderson and the team. You can make sure their voices continue speaking loud and clear by taking a moment right now and joining the Truth Team. It is easy, but you do have to visit our website or make a quick call. Go to pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. You have the power to make a difference. Joining the Truth Team can help ensure that millions of people will get a different opinion from the major purveyors of fake news. We don't get big advertising dollars like the networks or tax money like PBS. We depend on you. pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View.
And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for listening to the Thursday edition of Point of View. Over the next couple of hours, we're going to cover a lot of different topics. First of all, the whole question about whether or not to deploy federal troops to some of these particular cities where there is a crime wave has been a very important question. So we're going to hear from some of the comments by Andrew McCarthy as well as Senator Ted Cruz. Also, I've posted a piece by Tom Rogan, which you can read, Why Trump is Winning the National Policing Argument. But also, when we talk about defunding the police, what does that mean for the average citizen? So we'll get into some of that. We also, later this hour, will be talking with Anthony Hopp. He is the Vice President of External Relations for Samaritan Ministries. And of course, we always have loved these health sharing ministries, because in some respects, this is a way that you can gather together with fellow believers and pray for one another and really reduce the amount that you spend on health insurance. But we're also going to talk about a different topic that I thought was really interesting, and I put an article here, Why Hospitals May Soon Become a Thing of the Past. And he'll be talking about how some of these, if you will, urgent care clinics may be replacing hospitals. After all, if you've ever been in a hospital and paid $100 for an aspirin, you can understand why that might be the trend there. We will later on perhaps get into the question of, as we talk about healthcare, the fact that every hour 2,600 new coronavirus cases come online. We are approaching 4 million people in this country that actually have the coronavirus, COVID-19, and we're going to talk about what that means as well. And so on the one hand, that's kind of the fear, but on the other hand, there are many that are saying, even though that is happening, and needs to be controlled, that shouldn't keep us from reopening the schools. And so next hour, we'll spend some time talking about this very good article which came out from a number of professors at the Harvard School of Public Health. Listen to the science and reopen the schools. So we'll get into some of those topics. And then before the 2 hours are up, we'll have Brian Kluth with us, and we'll be talking about what I think is going to be something very significant, and that is the opportunity for you to bless your pastor. There is the Bless Your Pastor moment and movement, so we'll talk about some of that as well. Let me, if I can, just real quickly get into a couple of issues, and that is, of course, there's been a lot of controversy right now over what has now been called Operation Legend. Why is it called Legend? Well, that's the name of the 4-year-old that was shot to death in his sleep. And it's an attempt to try to get the federal, state, and local officials to cooperate. Not much chance right now in places like Chicago and Portland, but nevertheless, that is the case. And Andrew McCarthy, who's been on the program with us before and has, of course, worked in the federal areas so often, actually says that there is no need to recreate the wheel here, he says. There is abundant law that gives federal agencies jurisdiction to investigate and prosecute violent crime. Just as significantly, the federal government It'd be the U.S. Attorney's Office, the FBI, the DEA, other federal agencies in the U.S. courts not only have a long-standing presence in our nation's cities. For decades, we've also had federal state task force, which are joint investigative efforts involving the police and prosecution agencies of the federal, state, and municipal governments to combat gang crime and to even deal with the narcotics trafficking and gun crime. So the president, with elaboration from the Attorney General Bill Barr, explained this new effort called Operation Legend in honor of Legend Taliaferro, the 4-year-old boy who was killed in his sleep when a still unidentified gunman opened fire on his family's apartment in Kansas City. And so given the fact that the media has gone out of its way, and especially some of the liberal aspects of the media have gone out of their way to say that when we have these law enforcement agents, some of whom are on the ground, because I've already over the last couple of days talked about the Federal Protective Services, which are already in these federal buildings to protect these buildings, which are now being assaulted, burned, windows broken, vandalism, all the rest, graffiti. These are described as secret police, stormtroopers, militia, whatever. And that, of course, is not helpful, especially when some of the individuals that are actually feckless in the midst of some of the actions being taken, doing very little to actually protect not only the buildings, but all the businesses and all the citizens there as well. So critics will be quick, he says, to note that there was a political edge to the White House announcement. President, as he always does, talked about lawlessness being pushed by the radical left and actually concerns about defunding the police departments and the rest. But nevertheless, whether the president used the best kind of language to get it started, it certainly is an illustration of what we are facing right now. And because of this, Senator Ted Cruz went to the Wall Street Journal with this particular article, pointing out the kinds of things that we're starting to see in some of these areas. He says, for example, that you see one sign, for example, that said, every city, every town, burn the precinct to the ground. You know, that was a sign in the autonomous zone that was established in Portland, Oregon. You might remember the autonomous zone that was established in Seattle. But it wasn't until I read Ted Cruz's piece here that we also have autonomous zones in 6 other cities. That would be Asheville, North Carolina, New York, Philadelphia, Richmond, Virginia, Seattle, and Washington. And these are individuals that are out on the streets. They reject the rule of law. They're terrorizing the communities, as he says. And if nothing else, what we now see with one particular survey that was done of Portland concludes that, quote, businesses have racked up millions of dollars in property damage in Portland and lost sales, and hundreds of thousands of Portland residents have stayed off the streets for 6 weeks while that's been taking place. So one of the things that Ted Cruz is saying is we have a problem. Local leaders right now allowing rioters to destroy lives and businesses, and they need to be held accountable. So that's why he's introduced a piece of legislation called the Restitution for Economic Losses Caused by Leaders Who Allow Insurrection and Mayhem Act, or called RECLAIM for short. And this bill would actually hold state and local officials liable when they abdicate their legal duty to protect the public in cases where death or bodily harm or significant property damage have occurred. Specifically, the bill would allow for triple damages, meaning the plaintiff would be awarded triple the amount of the damage done to his or her property. It will also establish a federal cause of action, which would empower victims of violence in autonomous zones to take legal action against senior local and state lawmakers who allowed that to take place in the first place. I don't know how far that piece of legislation is going to make its way through the United States Senate, but if nothing else, it's an attempt to say we do hold you responsible. Whether that actually is passed by the House and Senate, and almost no legislation is these days, and signed by the president, it's at least an attempt to say we can't ignore the inability and the unwillingness on the part of some of these governors and some of these mayors to turn a blind eye to what is now millions and millions of property damage as well as the loss of life. We'll take a break, though, because Tom Rogan says this might be a really important campaign issue, and Donald Trump, he thinks, is winning the national policing argument. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
The headlines for a New York Times article said it all. Churches were eager to reopen. Now they're a major source of coronavirus cases. It's a scary headline that isn't even close to being accurate. Tim Challis, in a blog, started with the numbers in the story. It talks about 650 coronavirus cases from nearly 40 churches. That's not many, especially when you realize that nearly half of the cases come from one church in Oregon that was acting irresponsibly. Put these numbers in context. There are 3 million coronavirus cases in America. The 650 listed in the article represents roughly 0.02% of the total. And the 40 churches mentioned seem very small when you assume that there are more than 300,000 churches in America. Ed Stetzer went even further to list 5 issues with the New York Times article. First, churches have cooperated and have been remarkable partners. Second, hyperbole helps no one. Using words like major and erupted to describe 650 cases is obviously misleading. Third, the article understated the obvious. A large number of infections are linked to one single church that ignored all the CDC guidelines. Fourth, this kind of article causes people to dismiss important information. Finally, the article misses the point. If you read the article carefully, you will come to the opposite conclusion of the headline. Sure, there were a few churches that made bad decisions, but most churches seem to be acting responsibly in the midst of this pandemic. Most readers probably just read the headline or maybe the opening paragraph. Others merely saw the link to the article in the Drudge Report with the ominous headline, "Churches Now Major Source of Spread." This is a classic example of fake news. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Socialism, go to viewpoints.info/socialism. That's viewpoints.info/socialism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, let me talk for just a few more minutes about what is happening, of course, nationwide with this Operation Legend. But another important issue has to do with simply this idea that it may become a campaign issue. Now, Tom Rogan, I posted his piece here, Why Trump is Winning the National Policing Argument. I'd like to believe it. I'm not so sure I believe it, but I thought I'd let you have a chance to read it in its entirety, because he says the mayor of Portland and the governor of Oregon may not like it, but President Trump has a winning issue with his federal law enforcement deployments. He says a simple truth, one that Democratic politicians such as the Chicago Mayor Lori Lightfoot need to grasp quickly, is most people don't like to get shot dead. You think? And he says the facts are clear. The chaos in Portland is a direct consequence of the mayor and the appeasement of roving criminals. But rather than confront the destruction of private property and attacks on police officers and city residents, the mayor is actually putting out Twitter posts about federal law enforcement being like the Gestapo. And in Chicago, he says the mayor there is playing the same game. The other day, she put out a tweet that said, "Under no circumstances will I allow Donald Trump's troops to come to Chicago and terrorize our residents." Terrorize our residents, and the point he points out is it's almost a Shakespearean irony, because after that, just 30 minutes before she warned against this Gestapo invasion, you had 15 people that were shot outside of a Chicago funeral home. And if you've seen that, this car just pulls up and just starts shooting randomly. I mean, I don't even know what exactly was going on there. And we must note that the shooting is an atrocity, he says, reflected not of poverty, but rather of criminal gangs that have no regard for life. Gang violence motivated by the perception of offended honor and control over the drug trade source is the reason for most of that violence. And then goes in to talk about what else has been happening both in Chicago and Portland. And on the one hand, if indeed the press honestly covered some of this, and if indeed people sat down and really thought about it, do you want law and order or do you want anarchy? And I think in that respect, I think most people want law and order. But the argument that is being made time and time again is, well, we need to defund the police and we need to spend more and more of our time on community reaching out and community policing rather than law enforcement policing. Well, just ask this 33-year-old who took the advice from the Brooklyn Borough President Eric Adams in saying that what we really need to do is try to resolve various disputes through community policing. And so she decided that let's see if we can do that. And for the weeks leading up to July 4th, many of the residents there in New York City were plagued by people setting off illegal fireworks displays and at times even turning the firecrackers into weapons by firing them at other individuals. That's been happening in Portland. It's been happening in Chicago. Of course, it was happening in New York. And so on the 4th of July, this particular individual, Ms. Walls, confronted a few people setting off one such illegal display and told them to move their fireworks away from the children who were playing in the area, because she'd heard that what we need is more and more community policing. Take it on your responsibility. Don't call the police. Just ask these individuals to do the right thing. But during that confrontation, one person actually chased her into her mother's apartment building, fired a single shot at her while she fled. The bullet missed her, so she was able to recover the spent shell casing and also the driver's license of the gunman, which the person somehow had dropped during the chase, and then took that to the New York police, hoping that might be an action item by the New York police. You probably know what I'm going to tell you next. The police say they know nothing about it. Nothing actually took place. And 3 days later, on July 7th, the same suspect shot her 8 times and killed her. That's what happens when you think that the way to resolve some of these issues is through community policing. Or let's take $1 billion out of the New York Police Fund and instead invest it in various community service. It's all based upon what I would have to say is a really faulty assumption. And it's the faulty assumption that, guess what? People are really evil. And if you start with the idea that if we can just provide some more health care, if we can provide them with a number of counseling centers, a lot of the crime will go away. No, it won't. And you have to recognize that these are dangerous people. That's why we have the police in the first place. And it is a sad commentary on a 33-year-old who honestly thought that maybe she could be able to address many of these issues without calling the police. And even then, when she turned it into the police, nothing took place. And that's a sad commentary indeed, and a reminder of why you may not back the blue, but all of a sudden when somebody breaks into your home or somebody threatens you, you're going to want to call 911. Anyway, let's take a break, but just before we do so, let me mention a couple of things. My commentary today is about how the churches the other day were blamed for the source of the coronavirus cases, and I was smiling because when I wrote that a while back, we were talking about 3 million cases, and the fact is that the churches generated all about 650 out of 3 million. So that is 0.02%, but that number probably is even lower now because I have in front of me here the fact that we now have coronavirus cases approaching almost 4 million, with 2,600 new cases surfacing every single hour. And for those of you that are watching online, let me hold up just a graph that I think illustrates what's happening, because some people say, well, the reason we see more cases is because of testing. That is true. Testing has been going up. But the number of daily cases was up, and now it's jumped again. And even more concerning, what I'm going to talk about next, hospitalization. Back in April, we were at about 60,000 people in hospitals. It dropped down to about 30,000. Now it's risen again to about 60,000. And this next article I'm going to talk about, hospitals look like war zones. An eye-opening study from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention estimates that the coronavirus cases are a lot higher than the numbers reported. The number of confirmed cases, as I mentioned just a minute ago, 4 million, and has killed 143,000 Americans. And one new study, interestingly enough, has found that indeed social distancing with mask and hand washing stopped 90% of these large outbreaks. So it's still in our ability, if we were to act responsibly, to actually address those issues. But let's look at one of the biggest hot spots right now, and that's our friends in the state of California. More than 400,000 people in California have been infected with the coronavirus. 7,700 have died. And there are more people in California currently in the hospital than in any other time during the pandemic. Nearly 7,100 people are in hospital beds with COVID-19, and about 28% of those hospitalized patients are receiving intensive care, according to the state public health data right there. So you might want to know, where are we in terms of these vaccines? I've talked in the past about Moderna out of Boston. I've talked about AstraZeneca out of the UK, which is tied into the University of Oxford. But that just the other day, the Trump administration announced giving $1.9 billion in advance for Pfizer to produce 100 million doses of their vaccine that they are working on with a German company that should be available, they would hope, by the end of the year. This is all part of what the administration has called Operation Warp Speed, which is coming at a warp speed indeed, with the hope of having maybe 300 million doses from these different ones. Pfizer, of course, now using an mRNA vaccine, has shown that it not only provides neutralizing antibodies, but also stimulates T-cell response, which is key. Don't want to get into the biology too much, but antibodies diminish over time. T cells would have a longer lasting immunity. And of course, we also the other day reported that AstraZeneca has been going through its last clinical trials, and Moderna also was able to actually finish phase 1, and now is simultaneously doing both phase 2 and phase 3 at the same time. We always in the past have done these sequentially. Now we're doing them simultaneously. I do have some concerns about the fact that this may be happening at a very fast rate, but nevertheless, that's the latest vaccine progress report, and who knows, maybe because of the fact that we've had more people that actually have had the virus than we thought, and with the virus, we may actually get to herd immunity by this time next year or even earlier. That's very optimistic, but you just never know. Let's take a break, though. When we come back, Anthony Hopp is going to be with us. He is the Vice President of External Relations for Samaritan's Samaritan's Ministry, I should say, and going to be talking about whether hospitals maybe are going to be a thing of the past. We'll talk about that right after this.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
One of the things we want to spend some time talking about here, as we will connect up hopefully in just a few minutes with Anthony Hopp, who is the Vice President of External Relations at Samaritan Ministries, is, of course, we've talked about it being one of the largest health care sharing ministries in the world, and we've talked about how those are such helpful ways for those of us who are Christians to be actually in a relationship with other Christians to help meet those needs. But in addition to, again, the tremendous benefit of being part of a health sharing ministry, there is also the growing concern that we've talked about with people like Foster Freeze about the need for price transparency. And he was on the program with us the other day in which we talked about the president's executive order on improving price and quality transparency. By the way, I might just mention one of the other take action items that came from our conversation with Foster Freeze is still up there, one bill, one subject. So again, sometimes we've encouraged you to take action on that regard. But when you start looking at transparency, you'll even see one of my articles here that we've posted, Why Hospitals May Soon Become a Thing of the Past. And if you've ever gone into a hospital and then look at your bill and see that you're paying $100 for an aspirin, you begin to say, you know, maybe I can go to an urgent care clinic and do a lot better. And so we're going to talk about this idea of transparency, affordability, and how that maybe can be the, if you will, wave of the future. Anthony Hopp joins us now. He is Vice President at Samaritan Ministries. And thank you so very much for joining us today here at Point of View.
Good afternoon, Kerby. Great to be with you.
Share for our listeners who are not familiar. I think we've done this so many times, but you just never know. Some people don't know what a health sharing ministry is, and we've had a chance to talk with a couple of those that actually have existed, and for many times were exempted out of Obamacare, but now is not quite the big issue. But nevertheless, it's just a way in which we can minister to one another, substantially reduce what we would pay for a typical kind of insurance policy. So explain, because you have been involved with this for a quarter of a century with about 250,000 people. So talk about what is happening there at Samaritan's Ministry.
Yeah, this is a biblical non-insurance approach to healthcare. So it's an opportunity for followers of Jesus to live out what they believe and to do it in the area of healthcare. People of faith coming together to voluntarily share medical burdens. It's sort of like crowdfunding for healthcare, or what the Amish would practice in a barn raising, where a barn needs to be put up and the whole town shows up, and we're able to put up a barn in no time. Many hands making light work. It's the idea of not having to move a piano by yourself. And the striking thing about healthcare sharing Samaritan style is the direct component of it, member to member. So it is true that Samaritan members are sharing $30 million every single month, but I think the real interesting bit is that because of their direct connection with one another, they're able to pray for each other and send cards and notes of encouragement. So in this way, we're not alone when we face a healthcare challenge.
And you're really sharing, if you will, the possible risk pool with individuals that share not only your theological perspective generally, but also your lifestyle perspective and everything like that. And so I thought for just a minute we might talk about this idea of price transparency and why hospitals might eventually be somewhat obsolete. Now, I'm sure they'll always be in cities and things like that, but when you recognize that a third of the amount of money spent on health care, and last year it was $3.6 trillion with a T, a third of that went to hospitals. By the way, to help you understand, only 20% went to physicians and clinics. And when you end up getting if you will, sticker shock when you get your bill when you've been in a hospital. That's why more and more individuals, and I'm sure even individuals at Samaritan's Ministry that are associated with you, are starting to look elsewhere at so-called urgent care clinics. What have you found?
We found that there is definitely a trend toward decentralizing care. And while that may sound a little bit drab and dull, this is good news for us as consumers of healthcare, because it means more options. It means that ultimately we're moving closer to a consumer-driven, patient-centered model where we have options, where there's price transparency, where we're able to mitigate the risks of being in a hospital longer than we have to. And as you mentioned in your remarks, Kerby, hospitals probably won't be obsolete because they serve a very good purpose when it comes to large-scale emergencies and life-threatening injuries and that sort. But there's a whole host of treatments and procedures that can be done outside the roof of a hospital. There are things like imaging and dialysis and inoculations, and simple IV transfusions, and even joint replacements, joint replacement surgeries that can be done at other facilities outside of the hospital. And when we're considering at Samaritan what decentralized care looks like, we think it's a component of healthcare reform. I would think many of us would agree that true reform doesn't come in the form of mandates and insurance and taxes and regulations. It happens, of course, when we have a biblical understanding of healthcare, but also when free markets are allowed to flourish and there's innovation and there's transparency. And that's what decentralization does, is that it employs innovation and allows the consumer to see what services actually cost.
And again, transparency should be straightforward, but I use this example all the time. When I went to the doctor the other day, he said, I want to run some tests, but he didn't tell me what they're going to cost. And it wasn't until I went to the front desk to find out what I was going to pay. That night, though, I take my family out to dinner, back when we were able to go out to dinner, which has kind of changed with COVID-19. And I was able to know what I was going to pay because on the menu, we have both left-hand side and right-hand side. Left-hand side told me what was the particular entree, right-hand side what it was, and before the bill came, I'd already figured out what it was going to be and already calculated my tip. But when you go into a hospital, when you go to a doctor's office, very little transparency, and now the executive order by President Trump encourages some of that, but I can see why more and more people are saying, why if I need a hip replacement, why if I need to set a bone that is broken, why if I have maybe even pneumonia, do I need to go into a hospital when in some respects these urgent care clinics can give me, first of all, just the same kind of treatment, true price transparency, and maybe even a little bit more of the human touch than I'm going to get in a bureaucratic hospital.
That's exactly right. I think we're moving away from the insane billing system, and this isn't my own analogy, but when I heard it, I thought this typifies it beautifully. If you were to go buy a banana in a supermarket, and it's $1 if you pay with Visa, $3 if you pay with a MasterCard, but it's $12 if you pay with cash. But the rub is that you can't sign up for the Visa and get the $1 banana until you're 65. You can't get the MasterCard $3 charge unless you have a nice employer or a decent income. And you don't know the price of the banana until you've actually eaten it. And that's exactly what you're talking about. And so the idea of knowing what something costs is what we expect in other industries. I recently saw an example of a metabolic blood panel test. And the question is, does it cost $11 or $952? And of course, the answer, given what we're talking about, is it costs both.
Mm-hmm.
That these are both real negotiated prices that were paid by health insurance companies to laboratories, one in Jackson, Mississippi, and the other in El Paso. So, yeah, price transparency is certainly there. Just as an example, you mentioned joint replacement and knowing what it costs. There's a surgery center in Oklahoma run by Dr. Keith Smith. They perform 600 to 700 surgeries per month, and they post their prices on the website. And this enables, of course, not only for people to get the care that they want, but also to know up front what it's going to be and to save a significant amount of money in the process.
And again, you were talking about the fact in a free market, you can comparison shop. Now, when I've written about that in the past, I always get people saying, if I have a heart attack, I'm not going to comparison shop which hospital I'm going to go to. No, I understand that. But sometimes when somebody was going to get a coronary bypass operation, there was a difference of $100,000 between one hospital in a county very close to where I'm broadcasting from today and another hospital. So if you even took the time to ask, you would recognize I'm going to get the same kind of treatment in either hospital, and that one's going to cost, maybe not me, but it's going to cost the insurance company $100,000 more. And you can begin to understand that that's another place where the free market can begin to work. So let's take a break. When we come back, I wanted you to maybe spend a little little more time talking about what it looks like in a health care sharing ministry, because some people might wonder, well, that's nice for you because you are all healthy and all of that. But it does seem to me that when people are looking for health care sharing, they're looking for community, looking for cost. They're actually looking for no networks. And so I want you to try to answer some of the questions that are probably on the minds of some of our listeners. So let's take a break. And Anthony Hopp with us. We have a link so that if you would like to know more about Samaritan's Ministries, that is available at our website, pointofview.net, or you can just simply go to samaritansministries.org. Either way, we'll be back with him and you right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
For a few more minutes, Anthony Hopp with us, again, Vice President at Samaritan's Ministries. And let me just mention again that one of the things that I've always loved about these various health care sharing organizations is that you can have this sense of Christian community. It is lower cost. Of course, it's not insurance, therefore going traditional insurance, instead sharing our health needs. And Anthony, if nothing else, when you said that just a minute ago, I think that probably got a lot of people's attention. As big as you are now, you're sharing every month $30 million in medical needs from person to person. And so talk about what that looks like, because that I think illustrates again that you're no small entity anymore. It has been something that I've seen grown over the years, and really it becomes a viable option, at least for many of our listeners.
It has, and it's really a beautiful process. It, of course, is great to see that there's $30 million being shared, and, of course, people join primarily because they want a way to take care of their health care needs within their family. But what we see is that when a family has even an exorbitant need, you would think that the first thing they'd mention would be, my goodness, these strangers sent us tens of thousands of dollars to help us in our need. But that's not what they talk about. They talk about the cards and the notes and the reminders that the body of Christ gave them, that they weren't alone in their need and that God was going to be there with them and that they had gone through the same things themselves. And so that profound sense of community and belonging and really loving and serving one another is at the heart of what Samaritan members are doing.
Well, and again, because people are paying attention to that, they may go to an urgent care clinic and save money. They may decide to keep their elderly parents at home rather than institutionalizing them. And those are all good choices. But Anthony, would you be willing to answer some questions? Because whenever we have somebody on from Samaritan's Ministry or some of the other health sharing ministries, there's all sorts of questions. Can we let you answer maybe a few questions?
Absolutely. Yeah, I'd be happy to answer them.
1-800-351-1212. Let's take the first one here in Missouri. KTTK. Janet, you're on with Anthony Hopp.
Hi. I have a question about, yes, hi, and thanks for being on there. My question is, when you receive Medicare, is your insurance available? And how expensive is it if you have diabetes?
Sure. Well, a health condition does not change the cost of the monthly share. And with respect to Medicare, certainly a person can still be a member. In that scenario, Janet, Samaritan Ministries comes secondary. And so any bills that a member may have would be first submitted to Medicare, and then Samaritan could be used in a supplemental fashion. We don't call it a supplement since healthcare sharing is not insurance. But certainly those two can work in tandem with each other.
Okay. So with my husband still working and it has 2 years to retire, I'm not working, and I have one of those outrageous expensive insurance every month that doesn't pay for nothing. But
we've all seen that, haven't we? Yes.
Yeah. Would I be able to get on the insurance, or like some of them said, well, my husband has to be on there with me, or just sit individually?
Certainly one person in a household can join, so we don't require that multiple members of the household participate, and so that happens frequently. Somebody may have, within a household, may have employer-provided insurance or be in Medicare or have the VA or whatever their situation is. So certainly that can happen with no problem.
Sure. You know, one of the other benefits I might just mention is, I said that in passing just with a bit of a smile, no networks, because that's one of the difficulties that people, when they go through traditional insurance, and again, I'll say this again, as we have a couple times, this is not traditional insurance. It's not insurance. But when you do go through a typical insurance policy, there are all sorts of rules, regulations, doctors, care facilities, and all sorts of things that are either covered or not. This gives, I think, most of your members a lot more freedom, doesn't it?
It sure does. It puts them in the driver's seat. Unfortunately, so much of our health care involves third parties who really know little about my particular need or circumstance, and typically the third parties have little to no medical training, but yet they exert an inordinate amount of influence and determination with respect to the kind of health care that people receive. So our philosophy is those decisions should be between the patient and the physician.
Yeah, and again, when you are talking about this, you really are talking about kind of a biblical lifestyle, because I recognize that back before I got involved in some of these health share ministries, I would be put in a risk pool, and that risk pool would involve people that did not have my same philosophy of life. They might be using drugs. They might have been engaged in all sorts of dangerous behavior. They might have been sexually promiscuous. I mean, you can just start beginning to think about how that your premiums go up. And when you are talking about being in a biblical community, You're talking about people that have a much healthier lifestyle, and you also share not only the view of your physical body, but also the body of Christ. And I think that's just another benefit of being involved with one of these particular groups, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, we're like-minded, not just in our lifestyle, but also in our philosophy that we want to be obedient to all of the exhortations to believers around one another. And I believe there's 47 commandments to believers: love one another, share with one another, pray for each other. And so this is a way that the body of Christ can live that out.
Just before I take another phone call, let's, if we can, talk about what people will find if they go to SamaritanMinistries.org. We have that on the website. And so people, if they're driving right now, don't have to remember how to spell it and everything, but it's right there. And when they go there and they say, okay, I want to check out a little bit more, you've got some information about membership options, how the sharing works, and even how to join. So it's really kind of one-stop shopping if they can just click on that picture of you and then the one that leads to SamaritanMinistries.org. Doesn't it?
It does, and there's also a phone number that leads to our membership development staff. They do a fantastic job of explaining the nuances of healthcare sharing. We recognize this is a different paradigm. It takes some getting used to. Sure. They're very non-pressure and consultative, so they can be a help, too, in the discovery process.
Let's go back to the phones. We'll go to Georgia this time. Shelby, I think you have a very good question, and you're on with Anthony Hopp.
Hi, does this cover naturopathy doctors and stuff like that?
Hi, Shelby. Yeah, one of my favorite parts of this approach is that we being Samaritan Ministries staff, we stay out of the treatment decision. So as long as your provider is licensed to practice in your particular state, doesn't have to be a physician, but as long as they are licensed to practice medicine, then that can be what we call a shared need. And so as an example, our family sees a nurse practitioner for functional medicine and for some issues that we have, and that is allowed under our guidelines. So we completely stay out of the treatment decisions and allow the member to make that decision. And just an extreme example would be if a member was facing the challenge of cancer and they wanted to treat it naturally and maybe nutritionally, that sort of thing is a shareable need. We don't require traditional treatment. It's really up to the member and their provider as to the kind of treatment they're going to receive.
Well, Anthony, I appreciate you being on the program. And if nothing else, thank you for watching a trend that I think is going to play out. And I even posted this article that was not by you, but someone else, why hospitals may soon become a thing of the past. And I think we can see why. So if you want transparency, you want to know more about this particular option, I would encourage you to go to our website, pointofview.net. And again, we have all the information that you would need, or if you want to, just go directly to SamaritanMinistries.org. Let's take a break, and when we come back, we've got a lot more to cover. And before the next hour is up, we'll talk about how you can bless your pastor. I'm looking forward to all sorts of things we'll be talking about, including, is it time to reopen the schools? We'll talk about that right after this.
2020. It's been a pretty eventful year. We've experienced international tensions over the coronavirus and lockdowns, economic uncertainties, cities overrun by protests, rioting, and looters, and coming soon, a presidential election. Question: where will you get real news, credible opinion, clear biblical thinking on the things that matter most? Answer: Point of View Radio with Kerby Anderson and the team. You can make sure their voices continue speaking loud and clear by taking a moment right now and joining the Truth Team. It is easy, but you do have to visit our website or make a quick call. Go to pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. You have the power to make a difference. Joining the Truth Team can help ensure that millions of people will get a different opinion from the major purveyors of fake news. We don't get big advertising dollars like the networks or tax money like PBS. We depend on you. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View.
And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me this hour. We're going to spend some time, first of all, talking about reopening the schools. I know this is still somewhat controversial, and love to hear your comments. 1-800-351-1212. But came across another article which I thought was very helpful. It appeared in the Boston Globe, and it is actually written by a number of individuals who are professors at Harvard School of Public Health. Now, what I wanted to do was use the article, which goes into some detail as to looking at the risks of keeping kids at home versus the risk of sending them to school. But I also had to say this with a smile, because it's very obvious that these Harvard professors do not like Donald Trump. And so they could not bring themselves to say, in this particular case, Donald Trump might actually be right. In this particular case, the Secretary of Education, Betsy DeVos, might be right. They just could not bring themselves to say that. So instead, they talk about how the president has kind of politicized it. And so finally, they say, as public health professionals and parents of school-age children, we urge the country, ignore Trump. But then the next paragraph basically says, instead, listen to the science, which says the schools can and should reopen. Oh, well, again, this is the way, liberals oftentimes say things. They can't bring themselves to say, well, in this particular case, we agree. You have heard me on many occasions where we'll talk about an individual that we might disagree with, and I'll say, but in this case, even though we oftentimes disagree on a lot of issues, we agree here, and I appreciate that. But they just simply start the article and end the article by ignore Trump, but then basically through the entire article essentially say that what the Trump administration has been saying is correct. But let's go back to their article, and you can read it because we've posted it on our website. They said, listen to the science, which says that schools can and should reopen for in-person learning with appropriate risk reduction strategies, while officials also implement aggressive steps to keep community transmission low. So let's look at each one of those. First of all, this article, because it is so well written and had to be short, has lots of references and links to all sorts of things we're going to talk about. So if you find yourself saying, I need to check that out, they've done a pretty good job. First of all, they say, listen to the American Academy of Pediatrics. And so you have a link there. Of course, if you've been listening to this program over the last couple of days, we've actually given you some of the quotes that come from the American Academy of Pediatrics, which also focus, they say, on science and not politics, and supporting a return to in-person schooling with new investments in safety, describing in-person school as fundamental to the well-being of the nation's children. So then they now talk about what are the risks if we continue doing what we've been doing. Here's a couple of them. Prolonged time away from the schools has led to months of lost learning. And the lost learning comes from the fact that we've always in the past had kind of a summer slump. From June to August, lots of times you almost spend that first month in August or September, depending on when your schools start, just trying to get back to where you were back in May. So the first issue, lost learning, and that link puts you in contact with some of the studies which have already demonstrated that this is worse, because for a lot of students, they haven't been in school since March, and they haven't really been doing very much in terms of virtual learning. Second of all, prolonged time from the schools also has led to widening gaps. That is, the kids whose parents are maybe more affluent, have access to computers, have access to fast internet, maybe even have access to tutors, who knows what all. And so there is a widening gap in terms of educational achievement. So then they point out that this is the worst for students of color and those in lower income households. Then they go on and saying adding months more to this toll will be an educational disaster, because now they're pointing out the fact that there are certain windows of time in which a child learns grammar, learns phonics, learns reading, whatever. And that can be a disaster because they may never then recover from those. Then they go on to point out that school closures also threaten some children's safety. One advantage of the schools is that teachers or nurses or others might catch a child that has been physically abused, or maybe also catch various health issues or educational deficits, whatever that might be, due to increased child neglect. Also, it hurts children's mental health because they're not socializing, they're not interacting with others. And finally, it can keep many of them from just getting enough to eat, because you may be aware of the fact that in many school districts, it is the school lunch program, even the breakfast program, that gives the children enough to eat, and all of that has been disrupted with the lockdowns. So again, they conclude at this point, the harms of school closure are clear. What about the risks of reopening? And they again give you documentation. Multiple studies show that children are not only less likely to become seriously ill from COVID-19, they're almost half as likely to get infected in the first place. I'll explain why that is in just a minute from a biological point of view, but let's go on. Overall, the rate of infection requiring hospitalization among U.S. school-aged children, 5 to 17 age, since the beginning of the pandemic through July 4th was roughly 1 in 20,000. 1 in 20,000. So again, I recognize if we open up the schools, the local media is going to have some, incredible story about this child that had to be hospitalized, but that was 1 in 20,000. And you have to keep this in perspective with all the others that are benefiting. So, children are not at risk. What about teachers and staff? Very good question. Again, they say listen to the science. A report led by the former head of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and they had to point this out, under President Barack Obama, because they didn't want to give any credit to the Trump administration. You kind of see the bias running through here. But anyway, concluded that children appear less likely than adults to transmit COVID-19 to others, unlike other viruses like influenza, though this evidence is still limited and preliminary. We talked about this last Friday. The children are not a spreader. Children actually end up being a break. It doesn't pass on. Then also they found studies examining schools with known cases of COVID-19 have shown very low transmission rates. For instance, in one case, just 2 students and no teachers were infected out of 863 close contacts. Others show 0 confirmed infections, even among teachers and students who sat in the same classroom with a symptomatic child. And there's a reason for some of this, and that is we now know that children have fewer of these receptors in their airways. When the coronavirus comes into your lungs, there are some hooks on the coronavirus that hook onto these receptors, and children have fewer of those receptors. So that's why even if they get the virus in their lungs, it doesn't cause them to get the disease. As a matter of fact, men tend to have more of those receptors than women, which is why we're seeing a disproportionate number of men who come down with COVID-19 compared to women. And there's all sorts of other things. But also one other thing, they found that children also generate fewer breath droplets that would actually transmit COVID-19. So again, you can see there are some very compelling arguments, which we've just documented, on indeed why the schools can actually be safer for our kids. When we come back, we'll talk about some of the other things they're recommending that need to take place, but we need to take a break. We'll be back with more right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
The headlines for a New York Times article said it all. Churches were eager to reopen. Now they're a major source of coronavirus cases. It's a scary headline that isn't even close to being accurate. Tim Chalice, in a blog, started with the numbers in the story. It talks about 650 coronavirus cases from nearly 40 churches. That's not many, especially when you realize that nearly half of the cases come from one church in Oregon that was acting irresponsibly. Put these numbers in context. There are 3 million coronavirus cases in America. The 650 listed in the article represents roughly 0.02% of the total. And the 40 churches mentioned seem very small when you assume that there are more than 300,000 churches in America. Ed Stetzer went even further to list 5 issues with the New York Times article. First, churches have cooperated and have been remarkable partners. Second, hyperbole helps no one. Using words like major and erupted to describe 650 cases is obviously misleading. Third, the article understated the obvious. A large number of infections are linked to one single church that ignored all the CDC guidelines. Fourth, this kind of article causes people to dismiss important information. Finally, the article misses the point. If you read the article carefully, you will come to the opposite conclusion of the headline. Sure, there were a few churches that made bad decisions, but most churches seem to be acting responsibly in the midst of this pandemic. Most readers probably just read the headline or maybe the opening paragraph. Others merely saw the link to the article in the Drudge Report with the ominous headline, "Churches Now Major Source of Spread." This is a classic example of fake news. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Socialism, go to viewpoints.info/socialism. That's viewpoints.info/socialism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, let me again go back to this article that appeared in the Boston Globe. I think it was very well done. And they are now, as I'm going to point out, after they've looked at the risks of staying in the situation we're in right now or changing it and getting back to school, they also then add some disclaimers. And I thought those were well done as well, because they said we're not advocating a return to schools as usual. Schools must aggressively implement proven risk reduction strategies. They say a layered approach should include, for example, rapid testing and contact tracing and physical distancing when possible, mask wearing with breaks built into the day, frequent hand hygiene, and well-ventilated spaces. They even talk about the fact that districts should consider adding tents and trailers and converting gyms and cafeterias and libraries to expand learning spaces, staggering arrival and dismissal times, something we talked about just the other day, prohibiting parents even from entering schools will limit one of the highest risks, having large number of adults in indoor spaces. And so, again, they recognize that a lot of this has to be done around the community of the schools, especially given the record number of infections that we have right now. But they do point out the interesting irony that in some cases we've had various situations in which states have opened up bars, gyms, public gatherings and others, but they won't open up the schools, which makes really no sense since they may be the safest group that could actually get together. And they said, really, reopening the schools should not be an us versus them argument. It's not a Democratic versus Republican argument. It's about our children and about the evidence. We should be following the science that says in-person schooling for our kids is too valuable to give up, and the risk of school-based transmission appears to be very low. You know, one of the lines we oftentimes get from, we heard this with former President Barack Obama, hear this oftentimes from a lot of progressives, that we need to be like Europe. Well, do you realize there are 22 different countries that are actually have students in class right now? They're in Europe, they're in Asia, they're in Australia, and they have not seen the kind of fearful reintroduction or spikes that many people have been talking about. And so, again, I wanted to give you this article. It, again, I got to say, it ends at the very end. Ignore Trump, listen to the evidence, reopen the schools. I just cannot miss an opportunity to take a shot at Donald Trump. But nevertheless, whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, whether you like Trump or you can't even stand him, the facts seem to be pretty clear. And I do appreciate the fact that these individuals in the Harvard School of Public Health have taken the time to put that together and given a fair amount of documentation. But if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Maybe you have some thoughts about opening the schools or keeping them closed. And if you don't want to talk about that today, I'm sure we'll probably get into it tomorrow here on Point of View. But while we're talking about the coronavirus, I thought it would be good to mention my Viewpoints commentary, because pretty soon we're going to be talking to Brian Kluth, Bless Your Pastor Ministry. So we want to talk about pastors and things of that nature. But my Viewpoints commentary today is an attempt to, again, encourage you to read with discernment. The New York Times article the other day had this headline: churches were eager to reopen. Now they're a major source of coronavirus cases. That is so inaccurate as to be laughable if it weren't for the fact that it's in the New York Times and then was reprinted and then featured on the Drudge Report and everything else. And so some individuals that we've had on the program, let's take Tim Chalice first, in a blog started with the numbers. He said, look, the particular article talked about 650 coronavirus cases from nearly 40 churches. That's not many, he says, especially when you realize that nearly half of the cases came from one church in Oregon that was actually acting irresponsibly. But let's just put them in some kind of context. And here, this article talks about the fact that we have 3 million coronavirus cases in America. As you heard me say an hour ago, we're now close to 4 million coronavirus cases, but I'll use the 3 million just to make it simple. And 650 cases out of 3 million, that's 0.2%. And 40 churches, that's pretty small when you consider that there is more than 300,000 churches. Some people think there may be as many as 350,000 churches in America. So that should be enough. But Ed Stetzer did a very good piece in which he listed what he thought were 5 issues with the New York Times article. He said, first, churches have cooperated and have been remarkable partners. Second, hyperbole, he says, helps no one. When you're using words like major and erupted to describe 650 cases, that's obviously misleading. Third, he says the article understated the obvious. A large number of the infections, as I pointed out a minute ago, all go to one single church that ignored all the CDC guidelines. Fourth, this kind of article, he says, causes people to dismiss important information. He's a subscriber to the New York Times and believes that good journalism needs context, and I would agree. And finally, he says the article misses the point, because actually, if you read the article carefully, you'd actually come to the opposite conclusion of the headline. Sure, there are a few churches that have made bad decisions, but most churches have been acting responsibly in the midst of the pandemic. But what did people see? If they saw the headline in the New York Times, or if they saw the article posted in Drudge Report, which had the ominous headline, Churches Now Major Source of Spread, that's just a good example, I'd have to say, of what we call fake news. And so, again, I encourage you to listen to Point of View. I encourage you to read widely, because sometimes the press I know this will surprise you, get it wrong, especially if they have a bias against churches in the first place. While we're talking about that, some of these fact checkers are driving me crazy because now people are saying, okay, is PolitiFact, which is a fact checker, going to come back and admit that it was wrong? Because back when he was a presidential candidate, Dr. Ben Carson, who's now, of course, the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, but back when he was a candidate, he made the statement that Margaret Sanger was an individual that had racist ideas, was part of the eugenics movement, and actually she believed, he said, that people like me, that'd be black Americans, should be eliminated or kept under control. Well, PolitiFact just had a fit with that, and so they published a fact check in October 5th, 2015. So that's really 5 years ago, I understand, that was saying that the claim by Dr. Ben Carson is false. But interestingly enough, we now have even Planned Parenthood acknowledging the truthfulness of what Ben Carson said. Because you have, in a sense, the Planned Parenthood of Greater New York. If you have not paid attention to this, they have now renounced the connection that Planned Parenthood has with Margaret Sanger, which, by the way, is hard to do since she was the founder of Planned Parenthood, but okay. And they've removed her name from a Manhattan clinic, and according to Planned Parenthood of the Greater New York area, it was supported by the national organization. So the chief equity and engagement officer for Planned Parenthood of New York told the New York Times the biggest concern with Margaret Sanger is her public support for the eugenics medical philosophy, which was rooted in racism, ableism, and classism. No word yet that PolitiFact is going to change their decision to label Dr. Ben Carson's claim as false, when now you have Planned Parenthood acknowledging that she was indeed racist. Now, a while back, you had Planned Parenthood trying to massage some of that, where they acknowledged that, yes, okay, Margaret Sanger did give a speech before the Ku Klux Klan meeting in 1926. If you've ever seen Dinesh D'Souza's movie, he has a reenactment of that showing her speaking. But I thought it was kind of interesting that our good friends at the Susan B. Anthony list just the other day told the Washington Free Beacon that PolitiFact's stance, I think, recognizes and it really reflects and even illustrates the really soft coverage that Planned Parenthood has been getting for years. The quote that comes from Susan B. Anthony was, quote, "PolitiFact is likely too stubborn to admit that they got it wrong. But what further proof do they need when Planned Parenthood itself is finally admitting that their founder is racist?" They went on to say the media gave Planned Parenthood a pass on this for decades, despite mounds and mounds of evidence to the contrary. By the way, if you go to the Smithsonian Institution, you will see a bust of Margaret Sanger, and a lot of people have said, now that we know her racist past, now that even Planned Parenthood acknowledges her racist past, isn't it time to take that statue out of the Smithsonian? I'll leave that to you. When we come back, we're going to talk about what we can do to bless your pastor, one of the hardest working people and maybe underappreciated people in the country, our pastors. So what can we do to be an encouragement to our pastor? Brian Kluth will be with us. We'll talk about that right after these important messages.
2020. It's been a pretty eventful year. We've experienced international tensions over the coronavirus and lockdowns, economic uncertainties, cities overrun by protests, rioting, and looters, and coming soon, a presidential election. Question: where will you get real news, credible opinion, clear biblical thinking on the things that matter most? Answer: Point of View Radio with Kerby Anderson and the team. You can make sure their voices continue speaking loud and clear by taking a moment right now and joining the Truth Team. It is easy, but you do have to visit our website or make a quick call. Go to pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. You have the power to make a difference. Joining the Truth Team can help ensure that millions of people will get a different opinion from the major purveyors of fake news. We don't get big advertising dollars like the networks or tax money like PBS. We depend on you. pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Going to talk about what you can do to bless your pastor. There is what is called the Bless Your Pastor movement, and I thought you would like to know more about that. You can go to blessyourpastor.org, and former Pastor Brian Kluth is actually an individual that we've had on the program before and really just wants to encourage you as you see your pastor and other people on your church staff, oftentimes working tirelessly to bless you. It's now time to bless them. And they've been through quite a bit, as you have as well, during this lockdown, this pandemic, and all the rest. This has always been an important ministry, but perhaps even more so now in light of all the things they've had to address in terms of the church and all sorts of other topics. So we thought we would spend just a little bit of time talking about what you can do to bless your pastor. And Brian, thank you for joining us once again here on Point of View.
Yeah, hey, Kerby, great to be on with you and your listeners, and we really want to encourage them today about their pastors and how they can love them well and support them, especially in the midst of these challenging times.
Can you maybe help everybody understand how this came about? Because we are well aware of the fact that sometimes we say this is the month in which you should do what you can to encourage your pastor. But as a former pastor, maybe you can speak to this issue and what are some concrete steps that we can take in order to be a blessing to those individuals that are the shepherds in our church.
Yeah, the scripture calls us to show our deep appreciation for those who minister among us. That's 1 Thessalonians 5:12. And so the Bless Your Pastor movement is really a call for Christians to think about who are they, what skills do they have, what are the resources they have, what can they do on a very intimate, personal level do to bless and care for their pastors. But it really gets very, very practical, because it's kind of the thing where if you're a hairdresser, cut their hair. If you're a barber, help them out. If you work for a dental office, help provide care for them. Because what most Christians don't realize is most pastors. Now there are those that make a lot of money. There are celebrity pastors, but that's not most pastors. Most pastors really struggle financially, and they work 50 to 70 hours a week. Many of them do not get benefits from their church, no health care, no retirement, things like that. And so there's the call in the Bless Your Pastor movement is to really come up with creative ways to do it. And the good thing is we have free materials for churches to help that happen. So when people go to blessyourpastor.org, I wrote a little flyer based on my life as a pastor, and it was 50 creative ways to bless your pastor and church staff.
I might just mention there's a step 1 on the 50 creative ways to bless your pastor. We'll talk about step 2, appreciating offer, and some other things. And as you pointed out, a lot of them are struggling financially because, let me also acknowledge another category of pastors I've met over the years, and they're bivocational pastors. And that is, they actually are not supported by the church. They may actually have a full-time job, but then they're able to be a pastor on Sunday, Saturday or Sunday, whenever it might be, that they gather together. And so as a result, they're even more strapped financially, but in some respects still expected to perform all the pastoral functions, which can be pretty exhausting. And you are a former pastor, so you can probably speak to that as well, can't you?
Yeah, I sure can. There are many, many bivocational pastors, and they do their service for the love of God and the love of their people, and they seek to shepherd them well. But yeah, there's a lot of demands on them, but always not a lot of financial resources. In my own church, I took a 70% pay cut to become a pastor. So I left my career field, became a pastor. My wife was fully supportive of this move. We had 3 young children at the time. And what I found was, though my pay went way down, the love of my congregation was really high, and the love I felt went way up. And so we had people like they would have a vacation home and they would share it with us. We did have people give us dental care. Some would take care of our car. Some people would watch our children. My wife got cancer. Ultimately, went home to heaven early with that cancer journey.
Yes.
But during those years of her cancer journey, people were always helpful. They gave us rides to her chemo. one of the things that they did was they would give us a lot of gift cards so that after when we picked up our kids, they were all in like middle school. She didn't have to go grocery shopping or make the meal or clean up and everything. We would just stop at some restaurant with a gift card, and by having those gift cards, we could have a meal together and enjoy it, and she could go home and not be tired from having to prep and buy the food and all of that. So there were just so many things that the people did to just show God's love to us, and we were so incredibly grateful.
Well, again, that just is an illustration of why we should be involved. And let's talk about kind of step 1, 2, and 3, because you first of all mentioned 50 creative ways to bless your pastor. And so you've got just an incredible list that people can follow. But then step 2 is where you could actually take up an appreciation offering. So what does that look like?
Yeah, what it looks like. So people go, they just get the free materials, blessyourpastor.org, or they get the 50 ways list. There's a variety of choices you can choose from your church. So they distribute that, but then we encourage them to take up an appreciation offering. So again, a personal example was, so I took this big pay cut to be this pastor at this church. And I remember we were coming up to Christmas, and I said to my wife said to me, how are we going to pay for Christmas? And how are we going to afford to be able to go back home and see some relatives over the holidays? And I said, I have no idea. I mean, we really don't have the money for gifts this year. We really don't have the money to go back home the 1,000 miles to see relatives. And then one day, one of the leaders in my church said, oh, Pastor, hey, did we tell you we take up an appreciation offering every Christmas? And I said, no, nobody mentioned that to me. He said, oh, yeah, every Christmas we take an appreciation offering. And I said, well, who gets it? He said, well, you do. I said, well, what about the other staff? Wow. He said, well, no, they don't get anything, just you. Mm-hmm. And I said, well, I appreciate that, but I said, all my staff, they all work hard too. And if we're going to take an appreciation offering while I'm the pastor, I think it should be for all the staff. And so they said, well, that's your decision. You want to divide it up with everybody? And I said, yeah, I really would. But it was a wonderful thing. And every year, our staff and myself, we would get $800,000, $900,000 over Christmas. And that appreciation offering, would bless us, and it allowed us to travel to see family. It allowed us to buy the Christmas gifts. So just taking an appreciation offering is a huge blessing. And I even heard of a church last year that did the Bless Your Pastor, and they took up an offering and erased the pastor's student loans.
Wow.
He was a pastor, and they wiped out his student loans, and he was going to pay for years. So there's so many creative things that can happen if church just takes up a special offering and lets people give to it.
Well, I'm sure you probably have a few stories of individuals that when they receive this, even just a thank you, much less an appreciation offer, pastors who probably are not able to maybe be speechless, found themselves speechless for the first time. What are some of the other examples you have in terms of some of the individuals that have been blessed by using this kind of technique?
I think there was one pastor out of Indiana, I remember, he said, Brian, you just started a wildfire of generosity.
It's so good.
And he said, it's just sweeping through this congregation, the generosity we're experiencing. I've never seen anything like it in my years of ministry. People loving on us, loving on the staff, caring for us. And he just said, it's just incredible what we're seeing happen. And a lot of pastors, pastors pastors cannot talk about this. Pastors can't bring this up. Pastors can't say, hey, everybody, it's Pastor Appreciation Month coming, or, hey, how about doing the Bless Your Pastor? This has to be the Christians listening to us right now, the leaders in their churches taking hold of this, because a pastor can be the recipient, but he can't ask for it. He can't encourage it. So it's really people saying, yes, we want to bless and care for our pastor. And I'll tell you, this COVID thing has really been challenging on pastors. They're working harder than ever to try to minister to their people as well as they can in the midst of very difficult circumstances. So they need the love and care more than ever.
Let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll continue our conversation with Brian for a few more minutes. But I wanted you to be able to find your way to the website, blessyourpastor.org. We have, of course, it on the website, pointofview.net. And I want you to be thinking creatively about what you can do for your pastor right now. And as he pointed out, those of you pastors listening, I know you can't bring it up, but hopefully somebody in your congregation listening right now will bring some of these ideas up. And when we come back, we'll talk about how you can partner with them, because they have some opportunities for pastor networks, denominations, and others to partner. There's also some great material. And then there's also, we haven't talked about yet, how to get the $250 gift card. And so we'll get into that as well. So there are quite a number of issues that we still have not covered. So what we want to do is encourage you to go to the website, pointofview.net. We'll talk about one other really significant benefit that you can provide for your pastor. But we need to take a break. We'll be back right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Talking about the Bless Your Pastor movement for just a few more minutes with Brian Kluth. And if you would like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. If you'd like to know more about Bless Your Pastor, just go to blessyourpastor.org. And it's as simple as 1, 2, 3. First of all, choose which one of these really great and creative ideas, 50 different creative ways to bless your pastor, which is such a great resource to think about different concrete things things you can do to bless your pastor. Number 2, you talked about Bless Your Pastor Appreciation Offering, which is something. But then there's another thing, and that is there's a gift card. So talk about that, Brian, if you might.
Yeah, we're very excited. The Lilly Endowment gave the National Association of Evangelicals some generous grants. And so we are able to give $250 Amazon gift cards to the pastors of every church that participates. So every church that just simply distributes the 50 ways list by email or in a worship service, takes the appreciation offering, and then lets us know, then we will send your pastor a $250 gift card, and it's completely grant funded. It is not a scam. It is not a promotional trick. Some people say, is this real? And it is real. We have real money. We're going to be able to help thousands of pastors, but we need people's help to just get the 50 ways list, take the offering, and let us know, and we'll be able to bless your pastor, and they will feel blessed when that happens.
Well, again, you've got Bless Your Pastor Toolkit, and also there's a way people can partner with you. Talk about that, because you would love to partner with other groups and networks and denominations and ministries and even broadcasters. Talk about that.
Yeah, and any ministry in America that serves pastors and churches, we have a way to give you a special custom link on blessyourpastor.org/your-name, and then you can kind of push this out to the pastors and churches the churches you serve, and it's completely free. Anyone can do that. Any ministry, any denomination, any pastoral network or a ministerial group, businesses that serve churches, even businesses that serve Christians can kind of get the word out about Bless Your Pastor. And again, if you want, we can give you a custom link to make that happen so that people know you're helping sponsor this. And again, it's all grant funded, so there's no cost. But people can just go to blessyourpastor.org and find out more. And we're ready to help you to help this happen across America.
And again, a lot of this was funded through the grant through National Association of Evangelicals, but you also have a link there to financial health through the National Association of Evangelicals, because what you want to try to provide actually through them are some of the best financial practices for your church. And it seems to me that at a time when there have been some really significant strains on a lot of churches and a lot of ministries, we recognize the impact that the lockdown has had on various individuals, maybe in your congregation, or even just trying to figure out what would be the best practices in terms of running a church. You don't have the luxury of having an accountant on your staff or those kinds of things. That's another resource. So talk about what's available there.
Yeah, so I've been in the financial ministry space for many decades. And so with the grant funds we were able to receive from Lilly Endowment, we created online content. So this is very important. Anyone at all listening to me right now, if you have any financial fears or any financial struggles personally, you can go to the naefinancialhealth.org website, and we have a simple online training thing called Bless Your Finances. Bless Your Finances. That can help every single person listening to us. 33 best practices, 170 some resources, all completely free. So that's at the naefinancialhealth.org website. But for churches and church boards and church leadership teams, we have church generosity materials we created online, video training and written materials that you can download on legacy giving, on a 40-day devotional for your church, generosity devotional, just so many different ways that your church leadership can be empowered, because our research shows that 65% of churches saw giving decline this year. And so leaders are going to need to think, okay, how do we encourage giving? How do we help people in times of need? And these materials at naefinancialhealth.org will do that, and there's no cost to anybody. It's completely, again, grant funded.
So again, if you go to the website here, we have some of the links, blessyourpastor.org. If you scroll down, you'll see the naefinancialhealth.org. You'll see the blessyourfinances.org. And most importantly, you'll see how you can get an 8.5 by 11 sheet, or you can get it tri-folded, or you can put it into a built-in insert on 50 creative ways to bless your pastor and staff. Then you can collect the pastor's appreciation offering, and if you do those first two steps, then number 3, you qualify for a $250 Amazon gift card. It's such a great deal. And so, Brian, I appreciate you having the wisdom and the tenacity and the desire to really help bless pastors. So I hope we'll do a lot of good work with what we've just talked about over this last half hour.
Yeah, thanks, Kerby. We really believe it's for such a time as this that this opportunity has been raised up. God has given us training resources. We have money, grant money to gift cards to pastors. So we're just looking to share it across America with as many congregations and as many pastors as possible. And you're helping make it happen because of your interview right now.
Thank you so very much for being with us. And Brian, again, appreciate your willingness to join with us. And I would encourage everybody to find out more by going to the website. So just before we're out of time here, let me mention a couple of things real quickly. We, first of all, have posted a number of articles over the next last few hours. We've talked about whether hospitals are going to be obsolete. We've talked about the whole issue of policing, reopening the schools. We've had links to everything from Bless Your Pastor to Samaritan Ministries. So there are just all sorts of resources that are there on the website, pointofview.net. As you go there, you'll also see my Viewpoints commentary today entitled Churches and the Virus. And I wanted to get that out because, again, headline in New York Times, churches were eager to reopen. Now they're a major source of coronavirus cases. Not true. And you need to hear the other side of that story. And so that Viewpoints commentary is available to you. By the way, if you haven't signed up to receive those in your inbox, we are glad to send them to you every single day. And my commentary yesterday was on the disavowed study, which is pretty amazing. It used to be that if you were to publish a study that was seen as controversial, they would maybe want to go and do a second study to see if it could be replicated or maybe challenge the methodology. But now, in this cancel culture, latest tactic is just bring pressure on the researchers in the universities so they'll disavow their own study. It just can't make some of this stuff up. So that is yesterday's commentary, and I'll give you a chance to look ahead tomorrow. My commentary is on Marxism. And, you hear people talking about Marxism, but we go into a little more detail because not only did Marx want to abolish private property, but I go through a number of other things that Karl Marx and the Communist Manifesto wanted to abolish as well. Family, individuality, nations, eternal truth, all sorts of things, and even abolish the past. So if you're not familiar with Marxism, that's a piece that you can read and maybe pass on to a young person who is maybe imbibed just a little bit too much Marxist philosophy when you sent him or her off to the university. So those are some resources we wanted to make available to you, and we do every single day here at Point of View. If you can help us out, you might click on that button that says donate. And most importantly, if you'd like to hear any of the interviews again, you can just click on the button that says listen, and you can download the podcast or watch, and you can watch it, or you can even go to the YouTube channel and find that as well. All available at the website, pointofview.net, providing you lots of articles, interviews, videos, and other things that you can take action on, and that's why we want to equip you to make a difference in your sphere of influence and in your community. First of all, I want to thank Andrew for his help engineering. I want to thank Steve. Thank you for producing this program, and certainly want to thank you for listening. We'll see you back here tomorrow on our weekend edition right here on Point of View.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.